The grave was fresh, the ground already hardening against the coming frost. Elara's rifle was useless, her pantry empty. She was a widow waiting for the end. Then he appeared, not a man from the town, but a shadow from the peaks, a giant Apache warrior named Taza. He looked at the cabin, then at her. His words were not a request, they were a vow. You will not face the winter alone. He paused, the wind catching his voice. And you will bear my child, a life for a life, a bargain made in desperation, and a secret that would ignite the valley. Before we ride deeper into the story, if the spirit of the old frontier still stirs your heart, the campfire tales, the courage, the dust, and the honor, then saddle up with us. Hit subscribe and ring the bell so you'll never miss another ride through the legends of the Wild West. Now, let's get back to the trail. The cold was the first thing. It wasn't just in the air, it was a predator. It had teeth. Elara sat on the floor, the rough wood numb against her legs, her breath a fragile cloud that dissolved instantly. Frost wasn't just on the windows, it was claiming them, a spider web of crystalline ice devouring the last of the gray light. The cabin was a tomb already sealed. She looked down at herself, at the thin, light-colored mini-dress that was her only garment. It was a cruel joke against the coming night, a flimsy piece of cotton, now heavily torn. Large holes ripped across the fabric revealed the tan skin of her upper chest and shoulders, the skin now pebbled with a desperate, agonizing cold, exposed to the frigid air. The linen was useless. Everything was useless. She held her husband's rifle across her lap. It was heavy, so cold it burned to touch, and empty. Her pantry, empty. The woodpile, gone. She was a widow waiting for the end, a failure. She had failed to keep the fire, failed to keep the food, failed to keep herself alive. The rifle was just a piece of cold metal, a monument to her inadequacy. Then, the air changed. The wind outside didn't just howl, it paused, as if holding its breath. She thought it was a trick of the hunger, a final, fading hallucination. But the shadows in the corner of the room, one of them deepened. It moved. It separated itself from the wall, detaching itself from the desk. It was not a man from the town. No one from the town was coming. This was something else, a shadow from the peaks. He filled the doorway, blocking the dying light, a silhouette of impossible size. He stepped inside. The floorboards didn't creak. He just was Taza, a towering, giant Apache warrior. His presence consumed the small space, sucking the last of the warmth from the room. He was shirtless, his tan skin pulled taut over a chiseled, muscular physique that seemed carved from the mountain granite itself. Long black hair framed a face that was severe, dominant, and utterly unreadable. Fringed buckskin trousers brushed the floor, and elaborate, traditional jewelry of bone and turquoise rested on his broad chest. He was an imposing, impossible force. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the empty hearth, the useless rifle, the devastation of her torn dress and exposed, freezing skin. He looked at her, and she saw no pity, only purpose. He looked at the cabin, then at her. His words were not a request. They were a vow, a force of nature, like the frost, like the wind. You will not face the winter alone. His voice was low, a rumble that vibrated in the floor. He paused, the wind outside seeming to catch the sound and carry it. And you will bear my child. Elara stared. There was no room for shock. Shock was a luxury for the living. There was only the cold, and this impossible heat, this dominant, living presence. He was offering survival, a life for a life, a bargain made in the absolute bedrock of desperation. She didn't speak. She couldn't. Her acceptance was silent. A single, slow nod, a movement of pure, animalistic instinct. The secret was sealed, not in words, but in the frozen air between them. Taza began the work. He was not a man, he was a purpose. The cabin, which had been Elara's tomb, became his domain. He moved with a terrifying economy of motion, a silent, methodical force. For a man so giant, he was a ghost. The floorboards, which had cried out under her husband's lightest step, seemed to hold their breath for him. He would disappear before the sun had even bruised the horizon and return not with a rabbit, but with a full-grown buck slung across his imposing, shirtless shoulders as if it were a coat. The sheer, dominant power of his chiseled, muscular physique was a constant, unnerving presence. He was impervious to the cold. The wind seemed to part around his tan skin. Elara, huddled on her cot, watched him, the tattered remains of her light-colored mini-dress a stark, pathetic contrast to his vitality. The large holes in the linen, revealing the tan skin of her upper chest and shoulders, felt obscene in the face of his complete, self-contained strength. He never spoke. He hunted. He tromped. The rhythmic whack, whack of his axe became the cabin's new heartbeat, a relentless, powerful sound that vibrated in her bones, a stark reminder that the world had not ended, but had simply changed hands. She was torn. A primal terror, cold and sharp, gripped her whenever he was near. He was the wilderness incarnate, the shadow from the peaks she had been taught to fear. He was the Apache, a word spat like a curse in town. Yet, the fire was roaring. He had chinked the walls with a mixture of mud and dry grass, silencing the screams of the wind. He had reinforced the sagging roof. The cold, that gnawing predator, had been beaten back. It huddled at the windows but could not enter. This burgeoning sense of safety was almost more terrifying than the fear. It was a betrayal of her old life, an acceptance of this new, alien reality. Their interactions were a silent, tense ritual. He would roast meat over the fire, the rich, smoky scent filling the small space, and place a piece on a flat stone near her. He never offered it. He provided it. He would then retreat to the other side of the hearth, his long black hair catching the firelight, the traditional jewelry on his chest gleaming. He ate. She ate. He reinforced a wall. She, her hands shaking, used in all in sinew he had left for her to patch a thin blanket. It was a tense, silent cohabitation. The unspoken bargain hung in every shared breath, in every crackle of the fire, in every moment his dark eyes passed over her. He was the ghost in her cabin, but he was the only thing keeping her from becoming one herself. The blizzard descended without warning, a deafening white wall that erased the world. It was not snow. It was an assault, an ocean of screaming wind and ice that hammered the small cabin. For 3 days, then 4, the sun was a forgotten rumor. The world shrank to the 4 walls of the room, the space thick with the smell of wood smoke, drying buckskin, and fear. The forced proximity was a new kind of torture. Elara felt trapped, not just by the storm, but by the sheer, dominant presence of the man who occupied the space. Taza was a towering, imposing giant, seeming to take up more air than the fire. He moved with a quiet, restless energy, checking the door, reinforcing the window slats, his muscular, chiseled physique a constant, intimidating display of power. His tan skin seemed to absorb the dim firelight, and the traditional jewelry on his shirtless chest would flash as he tended the flames. Elara stayed on her cot, a small island of terror, pulling a rough blanket up over the rags of her light-colored mini-dress. The torn linen was useless, the large holes exposing the tan skin of her upper chest and shoulders to the cabin's fluctuating temperature, a constant reminder of her outer vulnerability. The silence between them stretched, heavier and more suffocating than the snow blanketing the roof. It was louder than the wind. On the 4th night, the storm reached a fever pitch, the walls groaning under the pressure. Taza sat on his heels, staring into the heart of the fire. His long black hair was a curtain of shadow. The coughing sickness came with its nose. Elara stiffened. He did not look at her. He spoke to the fire, to a memory only he could see. My wife, Ina. She made blankets from the rabbit. Her hands were fast. He paused, his massive shoulders rising and falling in a single, controlled breath. My son was small. His lungs were weak. He spoke of the sickness not as a tragedy, but as a methodical enemy, a poison that had crept into a small band, stolen from the east. He described how the strong fell first, how the children grew quiet. He was not asking for pity. He was giving a report. I am the last, he said, the words dropping into the silence. The last man of the Cherkaw. The line is broken. The spirits of my fathers. They have no one to speak their name. He finally turned his head, his dark eyes meeting hers. The dominance was gone, replaced by a vast, hollowed-out void that mirrored her own. My vow. It is not for me. It is for them. This was not an act of conquest. This was an act of legacy. He was not a savage claiming a prize. He was a widower, as broken by loss as she was, bound by a grief so deep it demanded a future. He was a morally conflicted man, and in his desperate, ancestral bargain, she saw the same animal instinct for survival that had made her nod. Yes, the silence that returned to the cabin was different. It was no longer empty. It was heavy, filled with the ghosts he had named. The blizzard raged, its voice a high-pitched, mourning keen against the logs, a chorus for the lost wife, the lost son, the lost husband. The fire had burned low, the bright, crackling flames of their survival now reduced to deep orange and red embers, pulsing faintly in the gloom. It was a heart slowing down, waiting. Taza rose from the hearth. He did not rise like a man. He rose like a shadow detaching itself from the wall, a towering, giant form that eclipsed the dying light. His imposing, dominant presence filled a small space, his tan skin and chiseled, muscular physique seeming to draw all the heat from the air. His long black hair fell over his shirtless shoulders, and the traditional jewelry on his chest was dark, its turquoise and bone catching only muted, dying reflections. Elara watched him from the cot. She did not move. She could not. This was the moment the bargain, struck in frozen desperation, came due. Her breath caught, a small, fragile thing, a stark contrast to the howling gale outside. The wind screamed, a physical blow against the cabin, as if demanding entry, demanding to extinguish this last, tiny spark of human will. Taza crossed the floor. Each step was a measured, unavoidable beat, like a drum marking a solemn ceremony. He stopped before her. He was the mountain. She was the valley floor, awaiting the inevitable shadow. He did not reach for her with haste, not with a fire of passion. There was no fire of that kind here. There was only the cold and the vow. His movements were slow, deliberate, ritualistic. He knelt. The floorboards, for the first time, groaned under his weight, acknowledging the gravity of the pact. He looked at her, his eyes unreadable in the deep shadows, but the shared grief he had spoken of was still there, a vast, hollowed-out space between them. He reached out, his hand large enough to span her entire chest, a hand capable of crushing or, perhaps, of shielding. He did not touch her skin. He touched the tattered edge of her light-colored mini-dress. The thin linen, stiff with grime and frost, was a pathetic defense. He slowly, deliberately, brushed aside the torn fabric, exposing the tan skin of her upper chest and shoulders to the dying firelight. It was not a lover's touch, it was an assessment. It was a desperate act of life against an overwhelming force of death. It was the last ember fighting the blizzard. It was the future demanding to be born from the ashes of two destroyed pasts. The bargain was fulfilled in the suffocating dark, under the weight of the raging storm, bound not by affection, but by the somber, ironclad necessity of survival. It was a promise sealed in silence, a life demanded for a life lost, a ritual enacted while the world outside tried to tear itself apart. The thaw was a slow, dripping sound, a melting of the world. The snow receded, leaving a wounded, brown landscape, saturated and raw. The cabin, once a silent tomb, was now an island in a sea of mud. The isolation was broken. Elara felt the shift before she heard the horse. She stood in the doorway, the weak sun feeling alien on her skin, pulling at the rags of her light-colored mini-dress. The linen, still torn, still gaping with large holes, exposed the tan skin of her upper chest and shoulders, but now it was the attire of a survivor, not a victim. The sound of a single horse, slogging through the muck, made her freeze. It was Silas, grizzled, leather-clad, and a friend of her husband's. He reined in, his jaw dropping so far it looked unhinged. He was staring at her as if she were a resurrected corpse. Elara? His voice was a dry rasp, disbelieving. Why the Almighty, we marked you for dead. We were gonna come in the spring. He dismounted, his boots sinking into the mud, but his eyes were fixed on the ground near the door. His gaze sharpened. He knew her husband's boot print. He knew the print of her small, worn boot. A presence, High above, Taza stood utterly still, a shadow fused with the trunk of an ancient pine. He was the silent observer, his tan, chiseled, muscular physique a part of the landscape. His long black hair was stirred by the damp breeze, but he did not move. His dominant, imposing form watched the intruder, his gaze flat and lethal. Silas turned back to Elara, his suspicion of palpable, cold front, replacing the shock. "How?" he demanded, his voice low. He gestured to the secure cabin. "I saw your pantry before the snows, Elara. It was bare. You were done. How are you standing?" Elara's throat closed. She could feel Taza's eyes on her back, a pressure as real as the sun. I was lucky, Silas." Her voice was thin. "The deer. They came close. A terrible, clumsy lie. And I found some supplies buried that I didn't know about." Silas's eyes narrowed into slits. "Supplies?" he repeated. "And those tracks?" He pointed. "Those ain't from no deer. And they ain't yours. A traveler," she whispered, clutching the torn linen over her chest. A trapper. He passed through. He helped me. For food. He left." Silas stared at her for a long, heavy 10 seconds. He knew she was lying. He looked at the ridgeline one last time, a deep, primal unease settling on him. He mounted his horse, his face grim. "You take care, widow. The thaw. It brings all kinds of things out of the woods." He turned and rode away, the first seed of a dark, impossible mystery now planted, ready to be carried back to the valley. If you've ridden this far with us, tip your hat and hit subscribe to keep the campfire burning. Every day, we bring another tale from the old frontier, of grit, loss, and the kind of courage the West was built on. Until next time, partner, keep your powder dry and your heart wide open to the horizon. The weeks of mud and meltwater bled into one another, a gray, dripping passage of time. Then, the change happened. It was not a thought. It was a flutter, deep within her, a tiny, insistent tap. Tap. Like a bird trapped in a stone. The quickening. It was the first physical, undeniable proof, the living seal on the desperate, dark bargain made in the blizzard's heart. In that instant, the world recentered. The paralyzing, animalistic fear she held for Taza, the towering, silent giant who moved like a shadow, did not just fade, it was consumed, burned away by a new, white-hot, primal fire. A protective instinct, ferocious and absolute, flooded her. This tiny, secret life, this impossible pulse, it was hers. And because it was hers, he was no longer just her keeper or the man from the peaks. He was the child's father. He was the shield. This new, unbreakable thread bound her to him, a complex, non-negotiable tie of shared legacy and desperate survival. Taza sensed the change before she ever spoke of it. Perhaps he saw it in her eyes. His dominant, imposing presence remained a non-negotiable fact of the landscape. He was still the giant, his tan, chiseled, muscular physique a map of raw power, his shirtless form seeming to define the lingering mountain cold, the traditional jewelry on his chest a silent testament to his world. But the way he looked at her was profoundly altered. His dark eyes, once flat and assessing, now held a new, guarded reverence. He would track her movements in the cabin, his gaze lingering not on her, but on her center. He was protecting his line, the vow made to the spirits of his fathers. She was the vessel of his entire, dying legacy. He began to leave the choicest cuts of meat for her, placed on the stone. He would return with fresh water from the stream, not just the bucket from the barrel. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible shift, a silent acknowledgement of the new life. This shift broke their silence. The cultural bridging began, not with friendship, but with necessity. He started to speak, not in conversation, but in instruction. He would grab her arm, his massive hand a stark, dark contrast to the tan skin of her arm, exposed by the torn fabric of her light-colored mini-dress. He pulled her out into the harsh morning air. Here, he would point, forcing her to kneel in the snowmelt. He taught her to read the earth. This track, 3 days old. This one, this morning. The wolf walks here. He taught her to see. He would find a pale, sickly-looking root, break it open, and press it to her nose. Poison. Then he'd find another, gnarled and dark. Eat. He taught her to trap small game, his huge, powerful hands moving with impossible delicacy as he wove snares from sinew and grass. Elara, in her tattered linen, the large holes revealing her shoulders, was no longer a widow waiting to die. She was an apprentice. She was learning the language of the mountain, and she was learning it from the mountain itself. Silas rode into the muddy track of the town's main street looking like a man who had seen a ghost. He pushed into the dim, smoke-filled air of the saloon, his presence quieting the low talk. He was a man known for his steady nerve, which made his visible tremor all the more alarming. He downed a whiskey in one ragged gulp, the liquid fire doing nothing to warm the chill in his bones. "She's alive," he finally rasped, and the saloon went silent. The widow. Elara. She's alive. The men stared. It was an impossibility. That cabin was a death trap, a frozen coffin. Alive? One man challenged. "Silas, you're..." "We all knew. I saw her," Silas snapped, his voice rough. "Standing right there." "And the cabin?" "God Almighty. The cabin is stocked. Firewood to the roof. Meat. Cured meat. Everywhere. She's not just alive, she's thriving." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush that carried to every corner. "And there are tracks. Moccasins. But not like any I've ever seen. There. Massive. Sunk deep. The stride of a giant." In the back, Preacher Croft lowered his cup of chicory. His eyes, usually filled with a flat, pious light, now held a sharp, feverish gleam. Croft saw the new railroad survey stakes in the valley as God's own handwriting, a divine charter for their settlement. The native presence, the shadows in the peaks, were, in his mind, a satanic obstacle, a final test of their resolve to claim this new Eden. Silas's miracle was, to Croft, a profound blasphemy. That Sunday, the church pews were full, the air thick with unspoken fear. Croft mounted the pulpit, his gaunt frame radiating an emotionally complex, sincere fanaticism. "We have heard news," he proclaimed, his voice ringing with authority. "News of a survivor. A miracle on the mountain." He let the word hang, then twisted it. "But what kind of miracle, my friends? What miracle comes in the dead of winter, leaving the tracks of a savage? What miracle stocks a pantry when God-fearing men starve?" The congregation was rigid. "I tell you, this is no miracle of God. This is an unholy bargain." A collective gasp. "A shadow has come down from the peaks. A towering, pagan force, an Apache, and it has claimed one of our own." He painted a horrifying picture, twisting Silas's report of her tattered dress, describing her not as a desperate survivor in rags, but as defiled, a willing vessel for the wilderness. "That shadow, that serpent, stands against our sacred progress. It stands against the railroad. It stands against God's will. Fear is its weapon. But righteous anger," his voice boomed, "righteous anger is ours." The town's fear had found its focus. It was no longer a vague dread of the cold. It was a holy mission, the sound of shod horses, a clumsy, metallic intrusion, a jingle of spurs and metal violating the quiet wilderness, reached the cabin long before they arrived. Elara stepped out onto the damp earth, her hand instinctively moving to the new, firm curve of her abdomen. She was no longer the freezing, skeletal figure Silas had found. The pregnancy had filled out her face, and the constant, hard work of survival had put muscle back on her limbs. She was visibly stronger, her stance planted, rooted in the very earth she now understood. But the men who rode into the clearing saw only the distressing, shocking sight of her attire, the same white, light-colored mini-dress, now little more than a collection of rags hanging on her frame. The heavily torn linen, ripped wide with large holes, revealed the tan skin of her upper chest and shoulders, a sight that instantly confirmed every dark, whispered rumor they had heard. She wasn't holding her husband's useless, empty rifle in her hands, held with a confident, terrifying familiarity. It was a new rifle, long, heavy, and adorned with the distinct markings of the Apache. It was Taza's. Preacher Croft spurred his horse ahead of the small, armed posse, his face a mask of ruthless, zealous fury. Silas hung back, his expression deeply conflicted, alongside 3 other townsmen, all with rifles resting uneasily across their laps. Women. Croft boomed, his voice an accusation that echoed like a gunshot off the pines. You stand defiled. We have come not with aid, but with judgment. You have been accused of consorting with the heathen, of making an unholy bargain in the sight of God. Elara didn't flinch. The meek, terrified widow was gone, burned away in the blizzard. The woman who stood before them was a mother, a survivor. You're trespassing, preacher? Her voice was low and steady, a tone they had never, ever heard from her. Croft's eyes bulged, incensed by her audacity. We have come to cleanse this valley. Where is he? Where is the savage that has poisoned this place? Where is the shadow you have hidden? There is no savage here, Elara said, her knuckles white on the rifle stock. Only a woman you left to die. One of the men shouted, nervously raising his rifle. We saw the tracks. Silas told us. Put that down, Amen, Silas growled, his voice a low warning, but the tension had snapped, escalating to a breaking point. Croft raised his hand, as if to deliver a final, damning sermon. He is. Elara began, ready to defend him, ready to speak his name. Here, the voice was not Elara's. It came from nowhere and everywhere, a low rumble like distant thunder. They all froze, their heads snapped up, horses skittering beneath them. On the ridge directly above the cabin, silhouetted against the bright, cold sky, he stood. He was not hidden. He was revealed. Taza. He was a towering, giant Apache man, an impossible, dominant presence that dwarfed the landscape, seeming to touch the sky. His long black hair was lifted by the high wind, a stark banner against his tan, chiseled, muscular physique. He was shirtless, his broad chest adorned with the elaborate, traditional jewelry of his ancestors, turquoise and bone that seemed ancient and alive. He wore only his fringed buckskin trousers. He held no rifle, only a single, long war lance, its point gleaming in the sun. He was the reluctant hero, the shadow from the peaks, now made of flesh and granite. He did not move. He did not speak again. He simply watched. His presence stopped the posse cold. The air grew thin, the world silent save the snorting of nervous horses. Their bravado, fueled by the preacher's fire, evaporated into pure, primal fear. This was not a rumor. This was the god of the mountain. The message was clear, delivered in absolute silence. She is mine. This valley is mine. You do not belong here. Silas was first to break, his voice a hoarse whisper, physically yanking his horse's rein. Preacher, we're done here. We're done. Croft, speechless for the first time in his life, his face pale and mottled, stared at the imposing figure, seeing not a man, but a demon manifest. The men turned their horses, a clumsy, panicked retreat, scrambling back down the muddy track. They left, their fear now curdled and mixed with a new, potent, humiliated fury. The posse didn't just ride back into town, they fled into it. They galloped down the main street in a panic, horses lathered, eyes wide with a terror that was infectious. They were humiliated, their bravado shattered, their fury a brittle shell around a core of pure, undiluted fear. The townspeople poured out of the saloon and the general store, sensing the disaster. Silas was grim and silent, but the other men were babbling, speaking of a giant, a shadow on the ridge, a demon made of granite and shadow. Preacher Croft, who had ridden at their head, dismounted not with the shame of a failed leader, but with the terrifying, ecstatic certainty of a prophet whose darkest visions had been confirmed. He strode to the center of the street, his face pale but his eyes burning with a righteous, almost joyful, fire. I have seen it, he roared, and the town went utterly still. It is as I proclaimed. The shadow has a name. It is a beast, a towering, giant Apache, a shameless, pagan warrior, his muscular, chiseled physique bared to the sky, a dominant, imposing demon from the pit, daring to stand against the work of God-fearing men. He let the image hang in the air, the image of Taza's imposing form, his long black hair, his tan skin, the traditional jewelry marking him as other. The crowd murmured, their fear palpable. Then, Croft unleashed his true venom. And the woman, Elara, she is lost. He spat the word like a curse. She is no longer one of us. We saw her, clad in the rags of her shame. He painted the picture for them, his voice dripping with disgust, describing the light-colored mini-dress, heavily torn, the large holes revealing the tan skin of her upper chest and shoulders, a sight he now declared was not of desperation, but of defilement. She stands as his consort, holding his rifle, defending the savage against us. This was the secret, the catalyst, the spark to the dry powder. A white woman, allied with an Apache. It was the ultimate taboo, the confirmation of their deepest, most unspeakable fear. The rhythmic acceleration began. Croft traced his arms, his voice rising from a hiss to a thunderous command. This is the thread. This is the unholy alliance that seeks to poison our valley. That thing on the mountain. It is not just a threat. It is the threat. It defies our laws. It defies our progress. It defies our God. And it has taken one of our own. We cannot wait for the railroad. We cannot wait for the marshals. We must act. We must ride out. We must cleanse the mountain. We must reclaim the valley. This is not a choice. This is a holy war. For our homes. For our future. For our very souls. To the cleansing. A roar went up. The town's fear finally, fully, ignited into a single, unified, righteous fury. Dusk bled the color from the sky, leaving a cold, bruised purple that promised a deeper darkness. And with that darkness, they came. Not as a posse, but as a mob, a hydra of flickering, angry light. Torches, held high, cast grotesque, dancing shadows up the pines, their voices a low, guttural roar of righteousness and whiskey. They had come to cleanse. But Taza was not in the cabin. He had been waiting. The retreat of the posse had not been an end, it had been an announcement. He was a part of the forest now, a shadow detached, his towering, giant form melting into the deep gloom of the ridges above. His stand, muscular, chiseled physique, shirtless and silent, was coated in the evening mist. His long black hair was tied back, his face set like granite. His traditional jewelry was tucked away, silenced. He was a guardian, a reluctant hero, and his battle would not be one of slaughter. It would be one of time. Inside the cabin, as the first torchlight painted a wavering, orange thread on the frosted window, Elara's back arched. A sound, half gasp, half groan, was ripped from her. It was not fear. It was a pain that came from the center of the earth. They approached the cabin in a ragged, nervous half-circle, their bravado held aloft only by the fire they carried. Inside, Elara lay on the thin cot, her body seized by the relentless, creative violence of birth. She was still in the tattered, light-colored mini-dress, the flimsy, torn linen of pathetic garment against the ordeal, the large holes revealing her tanned, sweat-slicked shoulders and chest. She was utterly vulnerable, yet possessed by a strength that had nothing to do with rifles. Then Taza began to use the dark. A sharp crack, like a rifle shot, echoed from the high rocks to the left of the mob. Half the men spun, firing their guns at nothing, their bullets whiting off the stone. The sound had come from Taza's throat, thrown like a stone, a perfect mimicry. As they reformed, a horse at the right of the line screamed as a snare, laid hours before, tightened, pitching its rider into the mud. Panic began to ripple. He's surrounding us. One man treated. Taza, the imposing, dominant shadow, was everywhere and nowhere, a ghost using the echoes of the valley as his army. He fought a strategic battle, a silent war of delay. He was defending the vow. He was defending his line. A rock, dislodged by his powerful hand, crashed down the embankment, scattering the front line. Back in the cabin, Elara screamed, a raw, primal sound that was swallowed by the mob's own yelling. Her body was racked by another contraction, a wave of fire and agony. She was alone, in the center of the storm, fighting her own battle for the new life. Outside, Taza watched, his face impassive, a giant Apache warrior holding back the tide with whispers and shadows, buying precious, agonizing minutes for the child he had vowed to create. The diversionary tactics could only last so long. The mob's fear, momentarily weaponized by Taza's ghostly presence, finally gave way to a baser, more destructive rage. Burn it. Preacher Croft's voice, raw with fanaticism, cut through the night. Burn the nest and the serpent with it. Torches were thrown, arcing through the dark. The dry, aged logs of the cabin, seasoned by a brutal winter, caught instantly. The night exploded. The dark-to-light transition was not a sunrise. It was a hungry, roaring orange glow of destruction, a violent, hellish illumination that lit the entire clearing, casting the mob's faces in a demonic light. The fire devoured the roof, flames clawing at the sky, a sound like a freight train. Inside, the world became a suffocating, choking hell of rolling black smoke and unbearable heat. Elara gasped, her lungs searing, each breath a mouthful of ash. She was on the floor, clinging to the thin cot, the rags of her light-colored mini-dress soaked in sweat and the fluids of childbirth. The large holes in the torn linen exposed her tanned shoulders and upper chest, now streaked with soot. But she wasn't alone. In her arms, slick and new, was a life. A tiny, perfect, screaming infant, its cries swallowed by the inferno. She had done it. Amid the chaos, she had given birth. The door didn't burn open, it crashed inward, splintered from its very frame by a single, powerful kick. Taza filled the opening, a towering, giant silhouette against the wall of fire behind him. He was a vision from a primal world, his long black hair wild, his Dan, chiseled, muscular physique gleaming with sweat, the traditional jewelry on his shirtless chest reflecting the frantic, dancing firelight. His imposing, dominant presence was a force against the flames. For one agonizing second, he paused, a statue caught between two worlds. The moral dilemma was stark, brutal, and instant. He could hear the triumphant, drunken roars of the mob outside, a pack of wolves circling their burning prize. His massive warrior's hands clenched, every instinct screaming at him to burst out through the other wall, to meet their violence with his own, to fight, to end them. But then his dark eyes, cutting through the smoke, locked on the cot. He saw not just Elara, but the tiny, wailing form in her arms. His child, his vow, the future of his line. It was not a choice. It was a clarification of purpose. He chose the child. He lunged through the smoke, his massive form a shield, the heat searing his back. He didn't speak. He grabbed Elara's arm, his grip like iron, pulling her bodily to her feet. She staggered, a cry of pain torn from her, but her arms tightened around the baby. He dragged her to the corner of the room, to a section of the floor she had always thought was just loose boards. With one arm, he ripped the boards free, revealing a dark, square hole, a root cellar exit she never knew existed, one he had prepared, deepened, and extended in the silent weeks. Now, he commanded, his voice a low rumble beneath the fire's roar. He pushed her down into the cool, damp earth. The tunnel was short, a claustrophobic tube of dirt and roots, opening out into a dark, narrow ravine behind the cabin. Its exit was completely masked by the thick, billowing, acrid smoke that poured from the burning structure, a perfect curtain of their escape. He had led them not to a fight, but to water, or at least, to the damp, dark earth that would save them from the fire. They stumbled from the damp earth of the ravine, gagging on the acrid smoke, only to be met by the roaring, deafening inferno. The cabin was no longer a structure. It was a column of fire, a blazing pyre that cast a demonic, flickering light across the entire clearing. Taza, a towering, giant figure, turned to her, his back to the flames. The orange light hellishly illuminated his Dan, chiseled, muscular physique, the skin slicked with sweat. His imposing, dominant presence seemed to momentarily hold back the chaos, a single point of granite stillness in a world of violent motion. His traditional jewelry, turquoise and bone, glowed like hot embers on his shirtless chest. He looked at the bundle in her arms. For one agonizing, suspended moment, his dark eyes fixed on the wailing infant. He reached out, his massive, calloused warrior's hands, which had just been setting snares and dislodging stones, now impossibly gentle as they took the newborn. He held the child up, examining its face in the firelight. His vow, his legacy, his line. It was a look of profound, silent, terrible acknowledgement. Then, just as carefully, he handed the baby back to Elara, a transfer of the future, a final, binding act. His eyes met hers, The exchange was minimalist, high impact. There were no words of a future, no promises of return. Just the instruction. The creek, he commanded, his voice a low rumble, barely audible over the crackling roar. He pointed into the deeper darkness, away from the burning light. Follow it. To the hidden caves. Do not stop. Elara, her entire body racked with shivers in the aftershocks of labor, clutched the infant to her. The tattered, light-colored mini-dress was a ruin, the heavily torn linen, ripped with large holes, revealing her soot-streaked, dank shoulders and upper chest. She could only nod, her throat too raw with smoke and unspeakable, rising grief to form a word. Taza's gaze lingered on the child for one final heartbeat. Then, the father was gone, and the warrior returned. His jaw set. His entire, towering form became rigid with lethal purpose. He turned, his long black hair swinging as he moved, presenting his broad back to his child. He was the shadow from the peaks once more, and he was walking toward the triumphant, drunken shouts of the mob, toward the cleansing fire. He would give them the demon they had come for. He would be the diversion. He would buy them time. He disappeared into the swirling, acrid smoke, a giant, dominant silhouette swallowed by the inferno, his own war cry finally erupting, a sound not of this world. Elara fled. She scrambled, half crawling, her bare feet cut and bleeding on the sharp rocks, following the sound of water. She found a high crevice in a rockfall, a place to hide, to catch her breath, to shield the child. She sank down, her back against the cold stone, the newborn a tiny, precious warmth against her. She was hidden. She was alive. As she watched, the bruised purple of the night sky began to soften in the east. The rising sun broke over the sharp line of the valley, a slow, merciless, beautiful wave of pale gold. The new light hit the smoke. It illuminated the single, thick, black pillar rising from where her cabin, her old life, had been. It was a funeral pyre. It was a signal, a bittersweet victory. She had the child. She had her life. But Taza was gone. Her fate, and his, remained an open loop, a silent, agonizing question asked to the vast, indifferent, dawning sky. If this story stirred a memory or two, saddle up with us again. Hit subscribe and help keep these old frontier tales alive. Out here, every name, every trail, every sunset still matters. So till we meet again, friend, keep your hat tipped to the past and your heart pointed west.